was sort of joking about with some friends this week as I was preparing for the conference was that I was going to ask everybody if they knew who Mike the Deathless Chicken was. Well, apparently there was this chicken back in the 40s, and he was going to the slaughter, and the farmer pulled out his knife and chopped the head off the chicken, and the chicken, as chickens are wont to do, got up and started running around with his head cut off, except Mike didn't die. Mike stayed alive for years, and the farmer fed this chicken by stuffing corn down his neck hole. I felt like Mike this year trying to get ready for this conference. I still have my head, fortunately, so I'll do the best I can to do this without running around with blood shooting out my neck. So I think a lot of people here are probably familiar with John Dee, but I'll just give a little intro about who he was. He was 16th century mathematician, scientific thinker, and occultist. He was a great lover of books, which is why I chose him as the subject of my talk. I can relate to his obsession with collecting together knowledge of all different kinds. You know, Dee's considered to be a conjurer or an occultist, which he was, but he was a polymath. He was really interested in a wide range of things. Anything having to do with knowledge, he wanted to gather together books and communicate with other scholars, just so he could expand his knowledge and for his own well-being and also the well-being of England. So I'm going to talk today about some of the books that have influenced John Dee, some of the things he collected together, some of the things he wrote, and you know, I think a lot of people here are probably who are aware of John Dee are familiar with the Enochian system that came out of his travels. I'll be talking a little bit about that, but I'm mostly going to focus on things that other kinds of books that came up in his career. So we'll move ahead here. One of John Dee's early collaborators was Gerald Mercator, and he's best known for his maps. He did one of the finest maps in the world, and he traveled around and communicated with many scholars to collaborate with them and look at their maps and gathered all these things together. Well, Dee had the opportunity to travel to Louvain where Mercator was working, and they worked together for 3 years. In fact, they were inseparable. Over the course of those years, they only spent a couple of days away from each other. They were fascinated by the work, and they spent a lot of time together working on these things. And I think Mercator was particularly happy about Dee's collaboration because Dee had traveled around and also corresponded with many scholars, and so he was able to secure maps from different lands, and they were able to work together to sort of come up with this this project that they were working on. And after the 3 years that Dee was there with Mercator, Mercator was able to finish his celestial globe, which matched his terrestrial globe that he had made, and he gave a set of these globes to Dee as a token of his appreciation. But one of the things that Dee did while he was there working with Mercator was he was also trying to find books. He was always on the lookout for books and manuscripts to augment his collection. And of course, Dee unfortunately didn't have the kind of patronage that some of the other advisors to Queen Elizabeth had, so he was always trying to figure out ways to come up with money or trade for books. So one of the things that he did while he was working with Mercator was he was tutoring people in exchange for books. And so he was teaching people mathematics and these kinds of things for trade towards books. He did end up leaving some books and maps with Mercator so that he could carry on his work before he returned to his hometown. Another interesting thing that to know about John Dee is that he frequented a particular bookselling firm. It was a couple of brothers, the Berkelin brothers, and these two seals here I'm showing. This first one is the seal of the Berkelin Brother Company, and then their mark that they would put on their goods. Now these gentlemen had bookshops in several different countries, and Dee frequented these countries, he frequented their bookshops, including when he traveled around Europe. Now, one of the things that was interesting and innovative about these booksellers was that because they had shops in different countries, they started a courier service. They were one of the very first courier services. And so not only were they able to move books around through different countries, but they were also delivering messages and mail. In fact, Erasmus was one of the people that benefited from their courier service. He received his pension money through the Berkman brothers. John Dee actually patronized these booksellers for 40 years. And we've got records of transactions that he did with them. And so he spent a lot of time in their shop and a lot of money over the course of time. Although when he was traveling in Europe, he actually owed them some money.
Can you spell Berkelin for us? Berkelin?
Sure, it's Berkman, and it's BIRCKMANN. And you can find a particularly good amount about the Berkman brothers in the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain. They were quite well known in Europe. Yeah, it's skipping around a little bit.
It's a flashing sigil.
Exactly. One of the things that I discovered about Dee's relationship with these brothers was, of course, that he was buying books from them, but he was particularly interested in Paracelsian works and the works of Raman Lull. And the Berkmans, like many other booksellers of their day, were also printers, and they were printing the early editions of Paracelsus. They were printing early editions of what we now would refer to as pseudo-Lull. So it's interesting that the booksellers at that time, how wide of an influence they had, just because of their travels and because of their establishments around the world. So I found this a particularly interesting aspect of Dee's book collecting. So of course a lot of people are probably familiar with the fact that Dee lived in Mortlake on the Thames. And often the Queen's barge would go by Mortlake, where Dee was, on its trip to some of her other palaces. And occasionally the Queen would stop and visit Dee. Now, Dee's library was the largest in Europe during its day, had over 4,000 books and manuscripts. And just to give an idea of the scope of that, Oxford had less than 500. So this was a man who was bent on amassing the largest collection. When Queen Mary was in charge of the country, he tried to convince her to claim all of the books that were in the monasteries that had been slowly closing down. The collapse of the monasteries and the loss of funds going to those monasteries meant that all of those books and manuscripts were in danger. And Dee understood that this was really a significant challenge because there was a lot of information there. Before the printing press, manuscripts were produced in these monasteries, and so all of the knowledge was stored up there. And when the Queen was too busy doing other things and he was unable to convince her to start a national library, he traveled around and tried to buy as many manuscripts as he could. So one of the things that Dee did with his library at Mortlake was he had several laboratories. He had 3 laboratories in the libraries there. And he also had a sort of a program for scholars to come and use the library. So he was very open about communicating with scholars and allowing them to come and spend time there and do research, and as well as do some work in the laboratories. He had a collection of coins, he had a collection of seals, he had scrolls of genealogical information, and Dee was really keen on amassing this information and making it available to other people. Before he left for his travels in the 1580s, traveling around Europe, he decided to make a catalog of the books, which was quite extensive. And we still have this catalog, so we know what he had in the library. His own appraisal of the books was valued at £2,000. 533 of these pounds was accounting for just 4 books. There was a large volume in Greek, 2 in French, and 1 in High Dutch. And this one in High Dutch, he actually got 2 endorsements from these nobles that would demonstrate that he actually did pay this much for this book, because most people couldn't comprehend, well, why would you pay that much for a book? But he was concerned because when he was leaving the library, he wanted to make sure that everything was cataloged, because he was worried that things might be missing when he came back. We'll talk about his return in a little bit. So the Queen, although didn't hire Dee on as a regular at the court, she did patronize him a little bit. She would give him a little bit of money every now and then. We're speaking about Queen Elizabeth here, not Queen Mary. Dee actually drew up the chart for her coronation. When they found a wax figure of her one time, they went to Dee to ask him what to do, and so he helped out in that way. And so Elizabeth did favor Dee, and there's some speculation that Dee was used as a spy by the Queen's spy master, Walsingham. There's not a lot of information about that, but his travels around and his work with ciphers sort of indicate that sort of thing. And he would often sign his letters to the Queen 007. So John Dee was the original James Bond. So his influence at court still had a lot of sway. He was one of the greatest scientific minds of his day. He influenced early navigational sciences. Here we have his general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation. And in the illustration, you can see the boats there and the coastline. And Dee was really interested in these kinds of things, and his influence on the early navigators was important to the early British exploration of the Americas. So Drake benefited from his research, Frobisher benefited from his research, and some of these early expeditions ended up coming back to Dee. It's well known that he had this black mirror from Mexico, a piece of obsidian that was brought back. One of the people on the ship knew that this object was from a shaman, and they knew that Dee was interested in occult subjects, so they brought it back to him. Here's another interesting tome. This manuscript is in the Ashmolean Museum right now, and it's something that Dee made up for the Queen, and it's a beautiful illuminated piece. And let me see if I can get the title here for you. I'm having a chicken with head cut off moment. Oh yeah, here we go. This is from A Plain Discourse and Humble Advice for a Gracious Queen Elizabeth, Her Most Excellent Majesty, to peruse and consider as concerning the needful reformation of the vulgar calendar for the civil years and days, accompting or verifying according to the time truly spent. Can you imagine why I couldn't remember this title? So the calendar was changed many times over the course of the eras, and Dee was somebody who spent time studying these calendrics, and he tried to convince the queen to change it by showing his thoughts on the matter. Again, she was too busy for this, but it's interesting nonetheless. So I think probably one of the most well-known books that John Dee wrote was his Monus Hieroglyphica, which he also dedicated to the queen. The Monus really influenced a lot of later esoteric thinkers, and shows some early forms of how sigillic work began. In the Monus, he composes this figure that has all the different forms that are used in what we understand to be the planetary symbols. I'll try to explain this a little bit. You can see that the figure here is composed of a circle, a cross, a crescent, and then this symbol on the bottom, which was supposed to represent Aries, or an arrow. All these figures in different combinations make up the figures of the planets, the sigils of the planets. The only one that has all the figures would be Mercury itself, the messenger of the gods. So, of course, this treatise is a lot more detailed than that, but it's one of his more famous works. Now, I mentioned his work with Mercator earlier, and in those 3 years that Dee was working with Mercator, he wrote several texts as well. He wrote of the great conveniences of the celestial globe, concerning the distances of the planets, fixed stars, and clouds from the center of the earth. And he also wrote concerning the discovery of the true magnitude of all stars. Several of these books are translated and published in a book called John Dee's Astronomy, and it's really well worth a read. It's filled with great epigrams and really great observations Dee made while he was studying with Mercator. Later in life, he wrote other books as well. Here's one on mathematics called The Ground of Arts. This was published by Richard Record, and it's interesting because in it, Dee actually writes a poem. And this is on the reverse of the title page, and I'll just read this little poem because it's great. This was published in 1652. This particular edition, it's quite after Dee's life. Dee died in 1609, 1608 or 9. The little poem. That which my friend hath well begun, for very love to come and weal, need not all whole be new done, but now increase I do reveal, for herein I once addressed, and now again at thy behest, of zeal I do and at request, both wend and add, for a purpose, of numbers use, and encompass again, no wit nor language can express. Apply and try both day and night, and then this truth thou wilt confess. This is an exorcism that Dee wrote. It's a manuscript in Dee's hand, and he was asked to come and do an exorcism at one point. He wrote this piece. What manner of evil, if ever thou be, on God's behalf I conjure thee. I conjure thee with the blessed cross that Jesus was done, one with force. I conjure thee with nails 3 that Jesus was done upon the tree. I conjure thee with the crown of thorns that on Jesus' head was done for scorn. I conjure thee with the blessed blood that Jesus bled on the road. I conjure thee with the wounds 5 that Jesus suffered in his life. I conjure thee with the whole spear of Longinus till his heart can bear, yet I conjure thee nonetheless with all the virtues of the Mass. So Dee was a devout man, despite the fact that he was interested in the occult sciences. And he often would offer his services, and he would try to explain to the court that he wasn't a conjurer as his reputation had developed into, but a man of science, a man interested in spiritual subjects, but a man of science. His reputation for being a conjurer came about when he put on a play of Aristophanes, Pax or Peace, And in this play, he actually constructed a mechanical beetle that was designed to fly off the stage and carry one of the performers up into the air. And when this beetle performed its action, the audience was astounded and assumed that this was some kind of creature that Dee had conjured. Later, Dee tried to explain that that wasn't the case, that this was a mathematical machine that he had made. He was in Paris. This is quite a famous talk he gave in Paris, and the place was so packed that there were people standing outside on shoulders looking in the window, and he was giving a talk about Euclid's preface, his mathematical elements of geometry. This is a page from that book. And Dee actually brought the plans for the Scarabaeus to show off to some of the scholars and say, well, look here, this is how I did it. No, I'm not really a conjurer. This is a machine. Mathematics is a wonderful thing. You can really do some amazing things. So I mentioned earlier that Dee had a collection of genealogical scrolls in his library. He was really particularly interested in studying genealogies because he thought that he could show that Britain had a lineage that went back quite far and could claim things like the New World, or he also himself wanted to prove that he had some royal background. He was trying to get that patronage. So he was able to demonstrate that he did have some royalty way back in his family history. He could show the Queen, well, here's how I descended. And the Queen did grant him a coat of arms, which is shown here. The first initial cap in the book shows a rampant lion standing on a solid red field in some editions, and you can see just below it is the hieroglyphic monad down at the point of the shield, and up above there's a triangle. Dee often would sign his name as a triangle because it's the Greek D. Here's another image of the mathematical preface he wrote for Euclid's Elements of Geometry, where it breaks it down and explains the parts of the book. This is a folding plate that comes out of the original. So this was an important mathematical text, and the fact that Dee wrote the preface was something that was really highly regarded by a lot of the universities at the time. So he was able to travel around and speak about this. It's a pretty impressive tome if you ever have a chance to see it. You can visit a microfiche copy of it, a microfilm copy of it here at the University of Washington. Now, Dee's work with ciphers and alphabets and things is sort of well known. One of the books that he was really seeking after in his travels was anything by Trithemius. Trithemius is well known for his Polygraphia and his Steganographia. And this is a manuscript version of Trithemius here, showing some of the ways that things have been enciphered. And the Steganographia was thought to be a grimoire, but I think Dee understood that although it may be a magical work, he understood that the ciphers had to do with the juxtaposition of lettering and the hiding of knowledge. So Dee was keen on trying to find out about any way he could find out about knowledge, whether it was hidden or out in the plain sight. And he wasn't opposed to using magic to get this knowledge. So Trithemius to him sort of embodied this idea of science and magic coming together. Here's another page from Trithemius. You can see that there's a great number of numbers and symbols and letters arrayed in these squares. And the idea was that you could permutate letters and conceal or reveal messages. These letter squares or number squares that were used to encipher became a particular focus for Dee for a number of years. And he really sought hard to collect books and manuscripts that touched on these kinds of things. So I've talked a little bit about Dee's books and his travels around, but let's talk about Dee and Kelly for a minute. As I said, Dee was interested in uncovering knowledge, and if he wanted to look into the hidden side of things, he thought the best way to do it would be to try to make contact with the supernatural world. So he set out to try to find a scryer. He had a couple of failed attempts until he met Edward Kelly, who was quite readily able to see things and give him communications. So they had a good relationship in terms of these scrying conversations that they did, but it was a turbulent one at times. So Kelly, of course, was thought of as a scoundrel. He had forged documents. His ears had been cropped, and he's got kind of a bad reputation. And a lot of people say that Dee was duped by this fellow. Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I never met Kelly myself, but I find it hard to believe that somebody like Dee, with a scientific mind as his, would be totally duped. But on the other hand, you know, it's hard to say. One of the things that Kelly brought forth when he was interacting with Dee was he had this manuscript. He had a map, and he claimed that this map and another book that he had, an alchemical text by St. Dunstan, along with a little vial of red powder, he got from some innkeeper, and allegedly these came from Glastonbury, possibly robbed from a grave. So Dee was interested in finding treasure, of course. He had asked the queen for permission to find treasure by using magical means. He said, "Oh, I don't want a lot. I just want enough to buy some more books." That was always his excuse. We'd all love to do that. So Kelly came up with this map, and the map had the cipher text, and it didn't take long for Dee to figure out how to decipher the text. So he translated the text, and it told about a secret cache of treasure that was left behind during a battle, with the idea that it could be recovered later. And then there were these mysterious geographical locations that were represented in these discs. They never really found where those places were, but they spent a lot of time thinking about it. So here's another example of this idea of squares and languages. Dee was really particularly interested in ancient languages and ciphers because, as I said, he wanted to be able to get as much information as possible. So this is from his Liber Logeth, and you can see the set of squares he's arranged in this graph over here, and the list of letters on the bottom there, the Enochian. This was a format that Dee had learned from his studies of Trithemius and other mathematical subjects. He understood that if he permutated the letters, that there were certain structures inherent in patterns inherent in these mathematical arrangements. He, of course, was familiar with Agrippa, who had a series of magical alphabets and various alphabets in his 3 books of occult philosophy, as well as magic squares, planetary magic squares. And there are these ways that sigils and number magic could be affected by these mathematical arrangements. And there was other influence that Dee had in this regard. This is another example from some of his own writing. Again, a grid of letters. This is from a book that Dee owned, the Book of Saga. Now, the Saga manuscript was particularly important to Dee. It was something that he came across in his travels. And when he and Kelly got together to do the scrying sessions and communicate with the spirits, on their first session, Kelly made contact with what was purported to be the angel Uriel. And after they confirmed that it was Uriel, the first question that Dee asked the angel was, is my book of Soiga of any excellency? Pretty interesting question once you've made contact with an angel. I would imagine that that book really meant something to Dee. He went on to ask the angel, how can I interpret these tables? I really want to understand these tables. Can you tell me anything about these? And the angel replied, well, that book was written before the time of Adam, and only Mikael can help you with that. So talk to Mikael. Well, he tried, and the Enochian material that we're familiar with came out of these conversations. And we're talking about years of conversations that were detailed in Dee's journals. He never really found out about what these tables were for. He had an idea. Sometimes he'd refer to this book as his Arabic book. And for a long time, Dee scholars didn't even know what this book was. They thought it might possibly be the Voynich manuscript, which is another cipher manuscript that has never been deciphered. Lots of people have looked at it. So for a long time, people assumed that when he talked about the Book of Soiga, it must be the cipher manuscript, the Voynich manuscript, because they just couldn't figure out what it was, and he couldn't figure out what it was. But in the early 90s, Deborah Harkness, a Dee scholar, was working on her book about John Dee, and she discovered two of the manuscripts, the original manuscripts, one in the Bodleian and one in the British Library, of the original manuscript, the Soiga manuscript, and a copy. The one in the British Library apparently was the one that John Dee owned. This is the image that we're seeing here is the one from the British Library. When she made the discovery, that was news. 400 years went by, nobody knew what this book was that Dee was referring to, and now all of a sudden, here it is. It's a fascinating manuscript. It seems to have some sort of astrological material in it. The reason why he referred to it as his Arabic book was because the astrological material in it does seem to have a connection to Arabic astrological magic. This table that we're seeing here, there's a series of 36 tables like this in the manuscript. This is the first table of Aries, it says on the top there in Latin. And these are 36 by 36 squares of letters. And they appear in the reverse of the book. And these squares were the things that really captivated Dee the most. Another image from the Book of Soiga, showing that most of the book is written in this sort of versification, where you've got these letters on the side and then the verse. And there's a particular kind of gematria going on in this book. And when I say gematria, I mean number-letter combinations. The book explains different ways that numbers can be assigned to letters, and they're different from the usual alphanumeric system that we're familiar with in the West. So I think Dee was intrigued by this. He wondered what it meant, why it was different, and he hoped to interpret these tables with these numerical systems. And you can see the star that's up there and this square down below. These figures bear resemblance to some of the Enochian material that later came out of the angelic conversations. I don't think that this suggests that it was taken from Soiga. I just think that these square sequences and forms that Dee studied, he realized might be the best way to try to communicate these things that were coming through. Of course, the angels were specific about what they were doing, including dictating many passages backwards. And the thing that's intriguing about that is that in the Book of Soiga, many of the passages itself are backwards, including the title. Soiga is agios, backwards, which means holy. Of course, the angels informed Dee that's not really what it means. So he continued to be perplexed by this this manuscript. And for a time, he even lost it and was worried that he was not going to recover it. But he did find it again. That happened with some of the dictated books that they had. Apparently, one time they decided to throw them in the fire, and later they were recovered. It's intriguing stuff. So the Book of Saga, fascinating manuscript. So, let's see here. So I thought I would just take any questions if anybody has any questions.
Is there any plans on publishing a reprint of the Saga manuscript?
Well, a reprint of the manuscript itself could be interesting, but instead we're actually working on a translation. There's a transcription that's been completed, and the translation actually is also very near completion, and that will be coming out. It'll be published by Clavis Editions. There'll be some information about that on the website today, as a matter of fact. So that'll be a dual language edition, Latin and English, first English translation. That'll be available next year.
Can you say who is doing the translation?
Yeah, it's a German scholar. Her name is Andrea Esmiel, and she's a medievalist. Has been working diligently on the manuscript for a couple of years now, and I'm happy to say it's very intriguing material. So we'll be manifesting that here in the coming months. Anyone else?
Do they? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Roland.
Do they have any kind of astrological expertise helping them on the translation?
Yeah, yes, we do have some astrological advisors. There's an advisory committee working on this project. So there's a lot of people who have been working on this for some time, and we're really excited to have this coming out. Anyone else?
Why were Kelly's ears broken?
He was caught forging documents. They were related to real estate. When they discovered this, they gave him a warning. I'm sorry. It depended on where you were, but yeah, I mean, Kelly had to travel around. He had assumed names. He was also known as Edward Talbot. And so a lot of people were kind of worried about his reputation when he was working with Dee, but he seemed to be a sensitive, he was very sensitive to the scrying, so Dee went ahead and employed him.
What happened to his library?
Good question. When Dee, there was an occasion when the Queen's barge came down the Thames, and on the barge was a Polish prince named Albert Lasky. And Lasky was a particularly intriguing character. He had aspirations to the Moldavian throne, and so the Queen was concerned that his visit to England might be a spy mission of some kind. And so she went ahead and invited him. Oh, good, come along. Happy that you're visiting. Please let me show you around. And so he asked if he could go and visit Dee, and so the boat came down, and he came and met John Dee and convinced Dee that he'd like to do some of the scrying with him and Kelly. And of course, Kelly was like, "Oh no, we can't do this for Lasky. No, I don't want any politicians around. This is bad news." But Dee was like, "Well, we can't really say no to the guy." There's a rumor that there was a secret meeting between Dee and Bruno at that time, and that Lasky actually arranged this. I think it was Benjamin Woolley who mentions this in his book Queen's Conjurer. I think this would be such an amazing moment to see Dee and Dee and Bruno meeting each other at Mortlake. But I mentioned Lasky because, sure enough, during the conversations with the angels with Lasky, the angel said, "Oh, well, you should go with this guy." And so they ended up traveling to Poland with their wives, and that was the beginning of them traveling all over Europe. And during their absence, the library at Mortlake was ransacked. A lot of things were carried off and stolen. A lot of the equipment was destroyed. People thought of Dee as a wizard. They thought of him as a scary person, and there were people that sought money and also just wanted to destroy these evil contraptions that he had, because even though he said, well, the scarab's a machine, they didn't believe him. They thought that it was a demon of some kind. So unfortunately, the library suffered a fire. A lot of the stuff was stolen by people who knew Dee. Once they heard that he was out of town, they rushed to the library to try to get what they could. So we actually have a lot of the books that were in the original library have been discovered. They keep discovering more. It's interesting. There's this vein of scholarship going on that treats of the marginalia in books, and they've managed to track down quite a few of the Dee books that have his notes in them. And it's a fascinating study. So unfortunately, Mortlake was damaged and ransacked. Yeah.
You mentioned that there was a catalog of these books, though. So is that available somewhere?
Well, there's a couple of different versions of the catalog available. There was an edition of it published by George Hollowell, quite an early edition, but really there's the Watson edition is the definitive edition. Unfortunately, they only published a very limited number of them, and it's way out of print and highly expensive if you find it. But yeah, those things are available, and probably you could consult them at a university library if you did a little research.
Doesn't Holmes currently have one in publication?
I didn't of the Watson or the
just the generic.
Yeah. So there is a couple of versions available you can find, and I think Charlotte, J.D. Holmes may have one. You should visit him and ask him. The Watson edition is really the one to go after, though. It is the most complete, and I've heard it's been updated with supplemental material. Is there somebody over there? No. Any other questions? George.
In your opinion, what was it eventually in the content of the Enochian receptions that was sufficiently disturbing to either Dee or Kelly or both to say any?
Well, of course, the wife swapping was probably one of the most jarring incidents. And just previous to that, Kelly was imploring Dee that they should stop. And again, not knowing Kelly and not being there, I can't really say for sure, but it seems to me that in reading the material, for whatever reason, whatever Kelly's reasons were, he was wanting to stop. Whether what he told Dee were the reasons or not, it seems to me that the wife swapping thing coming right after that could have been a way out. Again, that's very speculative, but a lot of the material is very apocalyptic in its nature, and Kelly would have these fits where he would throw things around, and it's very apparent that Kelly became very uncomfortable near the end there. Again, I don't know why. Maybe it was because he was making headway into borrowing money from nobles in Prague, because they spent a long period of time in Prague. Emperor Rudolf II had sort of favored them. Dee did this outrageous thing. He went right to the emperor, told him that God commanded him to change his ways or he'd be blasted from the throne. Pretty dangerous thing to do in those days. And the emperor said, well, I appreciate you telling me that. Say, don't you know something about alchemy? Rudolf was really an interesting monarch, because he was interested in the arts, and he was interested in alchemy and the Hermetic sciences. And many of the more well-known alchemists went to Prague because it was actually legal to practice there, and he funded many laboratories. So the latter part of the angelic conversations, Kelly was actually making some headway in terms of convincing people that he knew what he was doing, because they had this vial of red powder that apparently was able to make transmutations in front of witnesses. Again, not being there, I don't know what happened, but apparently they were able to convince people. And you can see in the record that Dee was getting really frightened, because every time they would do one of these experiments, they would use a little bit more of the powder. And as they were getting towards the bottom, they were trying to figure out how to reproduce it, but they weren't making any headway in reproducing this powder. And so Dee was getting nervous, and he was like, I really don't want to do this anymore, especially in front of people in power, because if we can't do this, we're going to be in trouble. Eventually, that actually ended up being Kelly's fate. Was he borrowed rubies and all kinds of money from people, promising them pounds of gold in return. And of course, the powder ran out, and he was unable to make these transmutations. So they threw him in the dungeon, in the tower. And unfortunately, he didn't survive that place. Apparently died while trying to escape. And he wrote a book while he was in the tower, trying to convince Rudolf that he wasn't holding the secret from him intentionally. He was trying to share the secret, but that only God could reveal the secret to him. And of course, Rudolf said, "Well, that's fine. I'll just keep you in there until God lets me know." So it went for Kelly. So yeah. Anyone else? Thanks very much for coming. So we'll take a break, and the next speaker will be in shortly.